Number 10 is got your nose and your ears and a couple other limbs, because ancient civilization globally shared the unique agreement in the removal of someone's nose, ears, or both as the punishment for a crime. Tokugawa era Japan is no different. While flogging was a common penalty for crimes such as thefts, fighting, public intoxication, etc., amputation of the nose or ears or both replaced flogging as a penalty very early in this time, which it didn't last. This period of Japan follows a particularly violent one, and in the time of Tokugawa, they repealed a lot and calmed a lot of the criminal punishment laws from before. Regardless, commit the crime and pay the fine with mutilation. People who experienced this punishment were socially marked for their crime and were banished from hiding it. No big deal for those who had already been punished with exile and accompaniment of mutilation of their nose and ears. Female culprits of crimes that were punishable with mutilation, however, were never mutilated, but they were ordered to parade through the village naked, so I mean, pick your poison. Speaking of a woman having to pick her poison, number 9 is the tobacco ordeal. This is one of the most fascinating trial and ordeals that I have come across in my time researching. While there isn't much information, what little there is unique to say the least. So, a woman who has committed a crime goes through trial and ordeal the way that a man would, but often has different and less visceral ordeals. A favored way was the tobacco ordeal. A woman would be made to smoke several pipes full of tobacco, and the ash of the pipe was to be put into a cup of water as she did. No ash was to be spilled anywhere but the cup. This water and ash combo would be mixed together by a finger or spoon, and once the woman has finished her appointed number of pipes, she would have to drink the full cup of water. It was believed any woman who could smoke the tobacco and drink the ash water without feeling sick or dizzy was an innocent woman. Anyone who could not was guilty. Guilty of being a normal person, because who is drinking out of an ash cup and not feeling like death after? But anyways. Number 8 is the world's uncoolest face tat. Your parents could be disappointed about that face tat you chose, but imagine how much more disappointed they would have been if it was a government issued one smack dab in the center of your forehead. Tattooing in Japan can be traced back to 14,000 BC to 300 AD, when they were believed to hold a mystical significance. Afterwards, the culture moved away from tattoos well until the Edo period, where it came back in a very different way. For some duration of the time, a stamp-like forehead tattoo was the go-to punishment for a non-violent offender, like a thief, a loiterer, a vandal, whatever. It was classified as a type of corporal punishment like flogging was. Now usually it came with expulsion, which unlike exile doesn't kick you from the whole town, but it can kick you from your previous neighborhood. It was a fantastic record-keeping tab, however, as the tattoos were chosen by each region and was unique to them, making criminals from other areas identifiable. In most societies, if a tattooed criminal reoffended, they did receive the death penalty. However, some of the civilizations had a 3 strikes then you're out system. In 1745, tattooing replaced the previously discussed facial mutilation as society became gentler and less bloodthirsty. This continued over the years, with face tattooing changing to the less embarrassing and quite fashionable by today's standards arm tattoo. In 1872, the newly established government of Japan abolished the tattoo penalty for once and all.
Number 7. Sisyphus and Hades. Sisyphus was the first king of Ephra, a cruel king. He killed guests and travelers in his palace, which was a violation of guest obligations, which fell under Zeus's domain, thus angering him. He took pleasure in these killings because they allowed him to maintain his iron fist rule. Zeus was really pissed. Yeah, this guy was cocky, and he punished him for cheating death twice. But his younger brother, Hades, caught wind of this and was like, no. As a punishment for this trickery, Hades made Sisyphus roll a huge boulder endlessly up a steep hill, forever. Yeah, he was like, no, Zeus, I got this one. Brothers helping brothers. Hades then displayed his own cleverness by enchanting the boulder to rolling away from Sisyphus right before he reached the top, resulting in an eternity of getting jacked quads and hammies, and an eternity of uselessly, effortlessly, and unending frustration. Yeah, that's really annoying.
Oh, number 6 is gonna make me even more nauseous. It's tendon cutting. This makes me very squeamish. I'm gonna go fast. A customary punishment before and during the Edo was to cut the Achilles tendon of both feet. This was to maim a person for the rest of their life. No hunting, no working, heck, it couldn't walk in most cases, and you lost muscle connectivity that even aided in hip motion. This punishment makes you depend solely on others for the necessity of life. Seeing as this was usually a punishment for manslaughter or a passion killing, your family would have very likely disowned you anyways, leaving you alone to figure this out. One documented account is of an old man who had to move his body by dragging his legs using his hands and carrying 2 small blocks of wood in each to protect them as he did. did. If your tendons were spared, it was only to be exiled from your home and city forever, or to be executed.
Number 5. Trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal of water was insane. It's honestly hilarious to think of. It was a medieval method of determining guilt or innocence. Now the accused would be thrown into a body of water, often a river or a pond, something dirty back then, and if they floated, well, it was believed that God was protecting them and that they were innocent. But if they sank, however, well, they were deemed guilty. They were naughty, right? This practice was based on the belief that water, being a pure element created by the Lord, would reject impurities such as sin. And it was also thought that drowning was an acceptable punishment for those who were deemed guilty. Because, yeah, sure. The trial by ordeal of water was widely used throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and continued until the early modern period. So yeah, it lasted a while. However, it was eventually abolished due to its high mortality rate and, well, lack of reliability in determining guilt or innocence. It was a bunch of bullshit. Who knew? Water rejects impurities. That would be jarring. You try and have a bath, you just get launched out. You're like, oh, okay then. Gotcha.
Since we're already on the topic, number 4 is crucifixion. While it's unclear when crucifixion was introduced into Japan, likely 12th to 16th century, it had already had a 2,000-year history when they did. So the Japanese added some of their own twists to it, as you heard previously with the mention of an upside down or a water crucifixion. It was one of the 3 executions reserved for the worst of offenders. Alongside beheading and hanging, sometimes the 3 punishments would be mixed and matched. For example, crimes against individuals of higher social status and against family members or one's master could result in beheading prior to crucifixion. Adultery, theft, and subterfuge are all crucible offenses as they threatened both the social and political order. The person to be crucified would be carried out on horseback nude, adding to the humiliation of their sentence. He'd be poked and prodded with staffs by the assigned guards who would also carry a large banner with the person's name, offense, and punishment. Oh yeah, they aired your dirty laundry on the march to your grave. This route would also be set to pass the accused residence as well as the location of their crime scene. The accused was then tied at the execution site, and when the cross was risen and mounted with the accused tied upon it, the guards used their staffs to spear him repeatedly until a final thrust to the throat for an ending blow. And speaking of, our next brutal punishment is impalement. While Vlad Tepes, aka Dracula, is famous for this torture, he actually learned it from the Turkish while held in captivity and tortured for his own homosexuality. With stake impalement, a victim's back door is forced down on the tip of a long, sharp, greased up stake. This starts the impalement process. The stake is then hoisted up and the body weight of the victim on the grease pole would slowly slide them downwards. The pole would travel up the intestinal opening and up through the body very, very slowly. It was a brutal, slow, and agonizing death, and it was one that could take days. Sometimes the Ottomans would flay someone before impalement. Gaunching was another type of brutal impaled death. The victim would be quite literally thrown onto metal spikes, hooks, or rods, and then left to die on them. These hooks and spikes could be found over the edges of certain palace balconies. Number 2, we pull the saw. Or don't. Don't will sound better in a second. So, like a few others on this list, the Tokugawas let this torturous execution method from the past dynasty enter into theirs. However, they made some changes in the brutality of it. But before this change, this execution method allowed for an interactive experience. So step right up, boys and girls, who is twisted enough to slowly saw at the head of a man buried alive. In a book by Louis Froy regarding Japanese history, he describes the grisly execution of a samurai/bounty hunter. The man had attempted to claim a bounty target, but missed his shot. While he had escaped, it wasn't for long. He was captured and identified, and he was sentenced to the pulling the saw. The man had been buried up to his neck, and a saw set up next to him, with the signboard inviting passerbys to cut at his neck, slowly hacking the man's head off alive. Now, traditionally, this saw is also placed close enough to the victim's throat that the accused, while buried alive, could make the decision to speed up the process if they really wanted to. But like I said, changes were made. Metal saws, they were replaced with bamboo ones, and rather than being used to actually saw off the living's heads as they once were, they were now simply put on public display next to the condemned person for periods of days prior to their execution by other means. And number 1 is the painful honor sapuku, which literally translates means self-disembowelment. So before I unpack that statement, there are 2 forms of this execution: voluntary and obligatory. Voluntary is pretty rare. Circumstances such as warriors defeated in battle awaiting execution by their enemies and not wanting the dishonor of that. Meanwhile, obligatory seppuku seppuku, refers to the method of capital punishment for samurai to spare them the disgrace of being beheaded by a common executioner. This form of execution was ritualized as a result. Great emphasis is put on the proper performance of the ritual. It's to be carried out in the presence of one or more witnesses, sent by an authority who had issued the execution. While kneeling, the samurai would take a small dagger or short sword from a small table placed before him. The proper method, developed over several centuries, was plunging this weapon into your left abdomen, drawing the blade up laterally to the right, and then turning it upwards. A truly exemplary samurai would then remove the blade and push it into his sternum across the first cut and then up to pierce the throat. This is a brutally painful and extremely slow death to experience. Weirdly, for this twisted reason, it was favored by the warrior code used by the samurai as an effective way to demonstrate the courage, self-control, and strong resolve of the samurai, and to prove the sincerity of purpose even when facing their own crimes. Women of the samurai class also committed ritual takings of lives, but instead of slicing the abdomen, they slashed their throats with a short sword or dagger. A little easier on the girlies, I guess.
Number 10. Aphrodite and Lemnos. Kicking off this list, we have some pretty tame punishments. Definitely cruel to say the least, but more on the non-lethal side of things, as gods' sakes go. Apparently the gods love to be praised. Yeah, they're awesome. But sometimes they do some foul stuff. The goddess of beauty herself, Aphrodite, gets pretty pissed when she's not obsessed over. And the women of the Isle of Lemnos were kinda slacking on the prayer department. So she cursed the people of the island with a foul smell. I mean, that's pretty mean. Everybody stinks sometimes in life, you know. It's life. Little musk never hurt anybody. But apparently the stink was so bad, all their partners left them and they were quite upset.
Bruh.
Which I can understand. It was probably just the equivalent to like the Great Stink in Europe, you know? Bodies and carcasses on a hot grease day just heating up the water and stinking it up. But nope, now it's a curse. Poor women of Lemnos probably get that rep for a while, you know? Stereotypes, they're brutal. I don't like them. Also, little salt water under the armpits. Boom, easy fix. Number 9. Demeter and Asclepius. Demeter, goddess of harvest and agriculture, and her hatred for a certain mortal man. A king, actually. Demeter apparently was out looking for her abducted daughter Persephone and was thirsty from running around. Naturally. She found a cottage owned by a little old lady named Hecuba, asking to wet her whistle, and started drinking some barley juice. Thirsty as all Poseidon, she was chugging from all the running around. The son of the woman, just a little kid, basically was like, "Thirsty much?" Yeah, you don't mock a god, no man. She threw her drink in his face and turned him immediately into a spotted newt.
You're done. You're done.
Okay, couple things here. Little excessive, I think. I mean, what do I know? I guess you shouldn't talk shit, kid, you know? Talk shit, get turned into a newt. That's the saying, isn't it? Number 8. Demeter and Arisithin. Arisithin of Thessaly ordered all of the trees of the sacred grove of Demeter to be cut down. Yeah, that's a big mistake right there. Industrial logging. One huge oak was covered with beautiful wreaths, a symbol of every prayer Demeter had ever granted, and so the men refused to cut it down. Every other one, of course, yeah, let's go get that rustic log cabin look. Arisithin needed more wood, so he himself grabbed an axe and went out and cut down that last tree. He was cursed by a nymph, naturally, whose prayer had been heard by Demeter herself. Long story short, she was like, "You want to build and eat? No problem." Gave him the munchies of a lifetime. Non-stop hunger. And insatiable hunger. Guy ate everything in sight. He was so hungry, Guy started eating himself. Yeah, all of him. Look, I've been hungry and picked something off the floor, 5-second rule, no problem. But I've never garlic and buttered my own fingers. But greed is greed, firm but fair.
Get uncomfortable with number 7, the Steak Ordeal. This fun ordeal starts with 2 large vertical stakes driven into the ground on one of Tokugawa's 3 execution grounds. There would be multiple sets of these stakes depending on the height and weight of accused facing the stakes. This is because the body was to be stretched taut between the 2 stakes, tied by the wrist and the ankle joints. They start with the wrists to suspend the body and make it easier to tie the ankles, but once the victim was up on those stakes, their weight was all on them. Anyone tied up in this torturous fashion was forced to remain this way until they either confessed or, well, died somehow. Hanging by the hair of the head was another staking ordeal. Obviously, this wasn't something doable for someone without long hair, but worry not, as long hair was cultivated between both sexes, so there was never any shortage of torture options. While held aloft by two others, someone would tie the victim's long hair into a knot at the top of the stake frame. So, once they're tied, they let the weight of the person all hang from that hair until they confessed, or something uncomfortable to imagine happens. So,
Number 6. Hera and IO. Okay, so we're moving away from kind of firm but fair and non-lethals to a little bit more and more cruel. IO was a beautiful woman to whom Zeus fell in love with. A married man. Ugh. IO was the daughter of Inachus, one of the river gods and king of Argos. She was living in Argos when Hera learned about this secret relationship, and she was a little hurt. I mean, who wouldn't be? Stewing in her sinister revenge, Hera turned Io into a cow to keep her away from her husband. You know, pretty non-lethal. Very mean, but, you know, fair. After being cheated on again by the same woman, she was like, alright, I guess that didn't work, and Hera was like, I'm done. She then sent a giant gadfly to sting Io continuously in cow form until she ran away, mad cow style, wandering from country to country, always being stung. Okay, I get this. You want to stop hanging around my man? You get stung every time, okay? Yeah. Bye-bye.
and speaking of amputations, the classic rhinotomy is back. When is it not though? Pretty much every historical society was chopping off noses for some reason or another. This is because a mutilation of the extruding facial parts, so nose, ears, and lips, had detrimental effects on sensory, but it was also a permanent alteration of the most expressive parts of the human body. Rhinotomy was practiced by Greeks, Indians, Romans, Byzantines, Chinese peoples, and so on. While it was more prevalent in the Byzantiums than the Ottomans, it didn't change the fact that an unfaithful woman was subjected to it while the man could get away with just a flogging. The Ottomans and Byzantines also have documented history of having the husband of an unfaithful woman be forced to commit the mutilation. You're already heartbroken she cheated, now you gotta cut her face open too. Hard day for those guys. It also established rhinotomy as a punishment for Christian women who had consensual sexual relations with a Muslim man, or a Muslim woman who had consensual sexual relations with a Christian man.
Number 4. Arachne and Athena. Okay, so little hex here, little labors there. The wrath of the gods is pretty tame so far. Well, was. And then there's the story of Arachne. Ovid recounts the very talented mortal Arachne, daughter of Idmon, challenged Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, to a weaving contest. Yeah, you don't challenge the goats to what make them great, you know? When Athena could find no flaws or errors in the tapestry, she was pretty pissed. When Athena saw that Arachne had not only insulted the gods in what she had drawn, but done so with a work far more beautiful than Athena's own art, she was enraged. She ripped Arachne's work to shreds, and terrified of what comes next, Arachne took her own life. Athena brought her back to life, cursing her after a little sprinkle of Hecate's herb, an ancient poison. Arachne's hair started falling out, and then her nose fell off, and then her fingers, as her whole body started slowly turning into a giant spider. And this is apparently now why we have spiders. Yeah, thanks to this epic weave-off.
Number 3, the guillotine. A classic, not quite ancient, but we gotta mention it. First seen in France during the late 18th century as an alternative to other forms of capital punishment, all those other horrible versions. Those were seen as cruel and inhumane, but this one, dare I say, changed the game. It quickly became the preferred method of execution in France, and was used extensively throughout the French Revolution to execute thousands of people, including King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. The guillotine's popularity spread throughout Europe, with several countries adopting it as their primary means of capital punishment. They're like, hey, that looks pretty cheap and horrible, let's do that. It continued to be used until the mid-20th century, when most countries abolished capital punishment altogether. Now, despite its gruesome reputation, some argue that the guillotine was a humane method of execution because it was quick and painless compared to the other 9 that I've mentioned on this list. Oh my god.
Number 2. Poseidon and Pacifier. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more into like disturbing graphic land with some of the more cruel things here. What started out as a rumor that some people were kind of smelly is turning into like eternities of pain and suffering and stuff. Pacifier was a queen of Crete and often regarded as the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. The daughter of Helios and the ocean nymph Perse, Pacifier is notable as the mother of the Minotaur. You'll see why. She conceived the Minotaur after mating with the Cretan bull. Minos was required to sacrifice the fairest bull to Poseidon each year. One year, Minos, king, refused to sacrifice his most beautiful strong bull and sacrificed an inferior weak bull instead. Dude, don't f with the gods. As punishment, of course, Poseidon then cursed his wife Pasiphae to fall head over heels obsession lust for this beautiful giant prized bull. And
many months later,
Pasiphae gave birth to a half-human, half-bull creature famously known as the Minotaur. The curse was sent out as a reminder to her husband Minos, quality over quantity kind of deal. That's heartbreaking. For her, of course. Her husband's cheap, so she has to birth a bull. It's not really fair, I'd say. And coming in at number 1, Prometheus and Zeus. And our number 1 spot, of course, must go to the god of gods himself. He can be pretty shady. Cheating on all his lovers, fighting with his old man and his kids. He's a little unpredictable at times. This one, ramping up the cruelty, we have Prometheus. He was our guy. This demigod loved us and stole fire for us. He fought on our behalf. He led the Titans into a trap, securing power amongst the gods again. He was everybody's friend. Besides Zeus. Yeah, Zeus didn't like the tricks and the new plans and all the attention he was getting. So Zeus punished Prometheus by chaining the Titan god to a rock with the might of Zeus himself. And then, worst part of course, having an eagle day in and day out just eat his insides out. Basically just slowly eating him for eternity. He would heal overnight, but then come the AM, breakfast again for eternity. Okay, so a little humanity never hurt anybody except for poor Prometheus.
Number 10, the Judas Cradle. Right off the hop, we'll start with a bad one. I mean, they're all pretty bad, but this one is so specific, you know what I mean? This is a brutal torture device used in the medieval ages to punish those who were accused of adultery or blasphemy. Yeah, adultery. This is what would happen to you. Imagine this. The victim would be placed on top of a pyramid shaped seat, not really a seat at all, just a sharp pyramid, and they'd be slowly lowered onto it by ropes. Now the pointed tip of said seat/pyramid would penetrate their anything in this region at all bad, all rough time. And this of course would often lead to death due to infection. The Judas Cradle was painful, it was intimate, and it was slow. It was horrible. It was considered an effective way of obtaining confessions from suspects. Even if they were innocent, they're like, sure, I did it. Get me off of this thing. What the fuck? This painful and gruesome method of punishment is thankfully no longer in use today, obviously, but occasionally I'm gonna pop up and remind you not to forget about it. It's horrible. The Justice Department has things to fix today, sure, I'll say that, but at least we're not lowering the accused onto the chair of death. Let's leave that one in the past. Number 9, the choke pear. Great name, already looking forward to this one. Also known as the Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a medieval punishment device used to humiliate its victims, really. The device was inserted into the victim's mouth, or again, other places, and then slowly expanded open using a screw mechanism until it reached its full size. Yeah, almost like something from Saw, just like that, exactly. This caused immense pain and often resulted in permanent injury, or, of course, as you can imagine, death. The choke pear was also used to extract confessions from suspects or prisoners. Despite its gruesome nature, the choke pear actually remained in use for centuries and was only officially banned in the 19th century. Yeah, you're like, what is this, ancient Egypt, Rome, Greek, what is this? No, it's like 200 years ago. Today, examples of the device can be found in museums, so if you see something that looks kind of like a choke pear, they're all fancy for some reason. Take a minute and reflect on these horrors. They used to punish men for homosexuality with a choke pear. Humans are disgusting. Number 8, Scaphism. First used in ancient Persia. The victim here would be stripped naked and placed inside of 2 hollowed out tree trunks, or sometimes boats. But only their heads, hands, and feet were exposed. You were literally stuck in a tree. Now, if that's not already uncomfortable and haunting in the hot sun already, they would then be force-fed honey and milk until they were extremely ill. And of course, all of that happening in tight quarters inside of a tree trunk. Well, as time passed, maggots would eat away at the victim's flesh, causing infections and gangrene. And also, it's horrible. It's so uncomfortable. The process could take days or even weeks to kill the victim. This method of punishment was meant to be slow and painful. And of course, the typical ancient fashion, it was very public. Everyone came out to watch, serving as a warning to others who may have committed similar crimes that somehow deserve being stuck in a tree. No way.
Next up is swimming sacks, and not like an oversized ugly bathing suit, although we've all had one of those and it generally does feel like you're swimming in a sack. Anyways, a common execution for women, when they were executed, was being condemned into weighted sacks and dropped into the Bosphorus Sea. A story remains of how Sultan Ibrahim once executed his entire harem this way. Apparently one member had slept with another man, or Ibrahim simply wanted to noob ladies to pick from. Either way, 280 women were rounded up and put into weighted sacks that were tied shut around their necks. The reason we know this story is one of them apparently lived to tell the tale, raising eyebrows in Western Europe when her rescue by a French ship became a public sensation and her story swept newspapers.
Number 6. Iron Maiden. Great, now Run to the Hills. It's gonna be stuck in my head all day. Not bad, honestly not bad. Hit the thumbs up for the Iron Maiden band. Not for this content, just for the band. Iron Maidens were tricky. An Iron Maiden was a device used in the Middle Ages, and it was an upright coffin-shaped humanoid-looking box with spikes on the inside that would puncture the victim when they were placed inside and had that big scary door closed. The spikes were long enough to cause significant pain and injury, but not long enough to kill the victim immediately, ergo horribleness. The victim would be left inside for hours or even days, slowly succumbing to their injuries and eventually dying from infection or, well, just blood loss. This method of punishment was considered cruel due to its prolonged nature and the physical torment that it inflicted on the victim. Because yeah, even without the spikes inside, this one would drive me nuts. Oh, terrifying. It's like the movie Buried, but somehow worse.
Tsurushi is number 5. The Japanese were incredibly determined to keep Christian colonialists out of their nation. They represented imperialism and they were known to be dangerous outsiders, bringing foreign diseases and unnecessary wars and politics. Essentially, they didn't come quietly, they came quite noisily and bossily, and the Japanese just weren't feeling that. Now, the method they chose actually turned out to be incredibly effective and withheld Christianity from the country for far longer than many others had. This is because it was a wildly brutal method. Anatsurushi was used in the 17th century to coerce Christians to recant their faith after entering Japan. Victims would be hung upside down, suspended by their feet, and often lowered into a hole, itself often filled with excrement at the bottom. A cut would be made in the forehead around the temple area in order to let the blood pressure decrease in the area around their head. The aim was to break their resolve, to renounce their faith, or they would eventually die. For this reason, one of their hands would be left free and exposed so they may signal upwards a willingness to recant. Both Japanese and Western Christians are known to have been submitted to this torture. Sometimes there was a doctor around just to resuscitate them so they can continue being tortured. They were also subjected to head-down crucifixion and water crucifixion. Water style was carried out by putting an upside-down cross at the shoreline low enough at low tide and waiting for the tide to rise so that the person would eventually drown. Christians were treated this way until 1873 when Christianity was finally allowed into Japan.
Heard. Number 4. The lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler device dates back to medieval times, as all these great gadgets do, and it was used as a form of punishment for those who committed crimes such as heresy or treason. The device consisted of a hollow metal sphere with a long handle. It looks like something you'd get from Elden Ring. It's like a weird looking wand, I don't know. It was then filled with molten lead or boiling oil. You already know where I'm going with this one. The Punisher would then hold the sphere over the victim's naked body, always naked again, and then allow the hot liquid to drip through small holes onto your skin, causing severe burns and excruciating pain. Now, over time, variations of the lead sprinkler were developed, including ones with multiple spouts to, increase the amount of liquid being poured onto victim or victims. Yeah, they got creative. Just the thing you want to hear in this kind of list. They toyed around with some ideas, sure.
Number 3. Hera and Lamia. Lamia was a beautiful Libyan queen, and enter Zeus stage right. Of course, loved by Zeus. Yeah, basically through no fault of her own, she got the wrath of Hera upon herself. This dude's commitment skills leads these people to get in a line of fire with some nasty curses. Hera cursed this lady hard. Every time she gave birth to a child, Hera either murdered it or made her eat it, regardless if it was Zeus's or not. Hera was like, nah, never again, now eat it.
All of them.
Even babies that weren't hers. Basically every night Lamia would ravenously make her way village to village eating mothers' babies. That's horrible. She swore to bereave all mothers of their children just as she had been once by Hera. Trying to help, of course, Zeus gave her removable eyes so that she was blind but harmless in the day, but after she popped those bad boys in, feeding time. Hera's mean, man.
Number 2. The thumbscrew. This one, for some reason, this one hits me the most. Thumbscrews were a method of inflicting pain by crushing the fingers or the toes or sometimes the knees. They would make massive thumbscrews. Knee screws almost. The victim's digits were inserted into the screw and then it was slowly tightened, causing, of course, excruciating pain and potentially permanent damage. This form of punishment was commonly used during medieval times, of course, and as means of extracting information. Yeah, if you do that to me, I'll say anything in 4 minutes or less. It was also seen during the Spanish Inquisition to force confessions from those suspected of heresy. Thumbscrews were often made of iron or brass and could be adjusted to increase or decrease pressure on your body. Anywhere. Like I said earlier, they would get creative with where they would put these screws of death. not good. Despite its brutal nature, thumbscrew torture remained in use for centuries before eventually falling out of favor due to its, well, extreme cruelty. At what point do you decide, right? Like some guy's like, you know what? It's a little bit too much. Let's get this one. We're just gonna put him in the coffin for now. Thumbscrews are so old. And finally, number 1, cement shoes. We'll end on a 20th century mafia punishment because why not, all right? I wrote the thing. I can talk about what I want. Let's do it. You made it this far too. We'll end on a not horrible one. Cement shoes involved placing the victim's feet in, well, as you could guess, buckets filled with wet concrete, which then of course hardens around their feet. Science right there. That's how that works. Unless you have a moving truck thing, then that cement's gonna dry pretty fast. At that point, you're unable to move or escape, and the victim is then thrown into a body of water to sink down and drown. This brutal technique was popularized by organized crime groups and mafias and stuff like that back in the early 20th century as a way to dispose of informants or those who had betrayed the group. Betrayed the mafia. The first recorded use of cement shoes was in New York City in 1935 when 2 victims were found dead with their feet encased in concrete. Yeah, new fear unlocked. I never knew. There we go.
First up is probably the least horrible you could get, galley labor. And while it wasn't traditional in Islamic law, corvée or galley labor was introduced into the Ottoman labor system over the course of the 16th century in response to the growing manpower needs of the navy and city construction. These sentences were granted for a wide variety of offenses, including theft, atheism, drunkenness, homicide, sexual employment, forced intercourse, bribery, document forging, the list goes on. A sentence was never under a year, but usually an average of 8. Apart from the offenses mentioned above, galley sentences could be issued in lieu of other sentences if there's a demand for rowers from the imperial or local fleets, meaning the manpower needed for the navy could sometimes override a decision of execution or imprisonment, or even take death row prisoners to sea with them. The catch was that most sentences did not specify the time a criminal had to serve. It was left to the ship admiral or captain to release prisoners when and where he chose. So sometimes when a captain was convinced that the convict had reformed himself, but he needed all the hands on deck available, well, you're not going anywhere. You could quite literally be worked to death. It was just as true for the Ottoman as it was for the Habsburg government then, that it used galley sentences to enforce social control, even if the proportion of convicts in the Ottoman navy never reached the levels of the Spanish fleets. The grim reality of the penal system subordinated to the demands of imperial projects is that what separated life and death for someone was often whether they were physically fit enough to pull an oar. Next up is gonna sting. It's a kerbash. This follows galley and corvée labor because it was commonly used on the convicts discussed above. A kerbash is a strap-style whip that averages a yard in length. Traditionally, they were made of hippo or rhino leather and was used as a punishment and torture instrument. And the state loved these things. They were widely employed by officials for various purposes of the state, including the obtaining of confessions from criminals, the collection of taxes, and the enforcement of corvée and galley labor. In the interest of maintaining agricultural productivity and increasing state revenue, we saw the use of corvée labor, which was crop and construction version of galley labor. It was a common practice for the foreman to enforce this type of labor by applying a whip on the fellahin, which is the name for those criminals. This whip, made of particularly strong but dry leather, was said to be able to peel the skin off in sheets from its blows. If a trained hand wielded this against you, bones could break and skin could blister and even get friction burns. Part of the comfortable use was that it was codified in the Canon Aphrodite, the 1830s set of codes that dealt with crime and punishment. Within 55 articles dealing with offenses related to land cultivation, damages to public property, the offenses by public employees, 26 articles prescribed the use of a kerbash as punishment. A kerbash was sometimes an instrument used in our next punishment, foot whipping, also called falanga or falaka. One of the best examples I can think of in media is actually the second season of Criminal Minds, when Spencer Reid is taken hostage by a religion-crazed killer who tortures him with this method. Unlike most types of flogging, it is meant to be more painful than cause any actual injury to the victim. The received person is forced to be barefoot so that the soles of the feet are exposed. Ottoman falaka method has the victim also lie on their back with their feet elevated and bound. The underside arc of the feet are then repeatedly whipped. Falaka is usually carried out with a rigid and often heavy stick. It accordingly causes blunt trauma, leaving the person unable to walk and often impeded even for life. The Ottoman version causes more serious injuries than any other because of how the victims are bound. The person undergoing the falaka can twitch and struggle to a certain degree, and as a result, the stroke can land more randomly and can strike more injury-prone areas of the foot. The toes and feet bones will break, as will the shins, and then shin splints were also a side effect, and some people experience knee displacement as well. The immediate experience of pain is described as stinging and searing. The subsequent pain from the succession of strokes is often described as throbbing, piercing, and burning, followed by fainting.
Number 7. The punishment of non-existence. Ooh, this one's pretty good. It's different, but it's definitely worth a mention on our list today. When we talk about pharaohs, or pretty much anything from ancient history, we know nothing. I mean, really, so many books destroyed, that much time passed, there's countless leaders that we know nothing of, and it has a little something to do with damnatio memoriae. Damnatio memoriae was a practice in ancient Rome that involved erasing the memory of an individual or group from history. Just ever gone. Control-Alt-Delete, see you later, Brad. This was done by destroying any and all physical evidence of their existence, such as statues or inscriptions, and banning the use of their name. That's incredible. It was typically used to punish individuals who had committed treason or other crimes against the state, but it could also be applied to those who were, well, simply unpopular with the ruling class. Yeah, getting cancelled, but in ancient Rome. There we go. Some guy's scratching your face out of a rock. He's like, nah, you don't exist anymore, buddy. How's that sound? That's horrible. That is so, I mean, cutting to 2023 now, yeah, they're gone. We have no idea who they are. The effectiveness of this varied depending on the circumstances. I mean, in some cases, it succeeded in erasing the memory or the group completely, while in others, it only generated more interest in them. You know what I mean? You cancel somebody now today and you're like, well, who are these people? What did they do? Today we do this, but it's just, you know, blocking somebody on socials. Mute. See ya.
Hadud crime and punishment is next on our list. Not all of these are found in the Ottoman history, as there's some back and forth between the powers that be in the ways of religion. However, there are accounts of Hadud crimes being punished in Hadud fashions. Early Muslim jurists inherited the concept of a category of crimes called Hadud from references to it made by the Prophet. Their scholars agree that Hadud includes a multitude of crimes, including adultery, consuming intoxicants, false fornication accusations, some theft, armed robbery, or banditry. These are considered violations of the rights of God and human rights. These punishments are specified in the Quran and they're doled out differently each time. For example, adultery holds a punishment of 100 lashes, which would be done with a kerbash. And if one or both parties were single, they should also have a year of exile. A thief should have their hands cut off as a deterrent for further thievery. And someone who accuses someone else of adultery better have 4 witnesses alongside them. If they can't provide witnesses, they get 80 lashes and will never have their testimony accepted ever again. The Ottoman Empire was known for the removal of thieves' hands and sometimes feet, but also doled out amputation punishment for a few other crimes, such as disloyalty and perjury.
Number 5. Hera and Heracles. Bless my soul, Herc was on a roll, and Hera, the queen of gods, was extremely jealous of that. All those other women in her husband's life. Zeus's consorts, and Hera hated the kids that came along with the adultery. One of them being, of course, Heracles, who puts the glad in gladiator, Hercules. Yeah, that's the same dude. I was a 90s kid. As the story goes, Hera caused Hercules so much trouble that he was actually driven mad on one occasion. According to Homer, just before Hercules was born, Zeus announced a prophecy that would make Hercules the ruler of the heavens in his place when the time came. Hera didn't like that so much. She kind of pushed the birth thing a little bit. Hera also made Herc crazy. Little bit of roid rage, you know? In a blind rage one night, he kills his wife and son under the rage spell of Hera. Part of this punishment was that the insanity was just temporary, so when he came to and realized that he John Wicked everyone, yeah, she had won. In sadness, he smashed about 12 labors and got himself back on track. Talk about zero to hero.
Chop chop with the chop chopping, guys. It's time to be flayed alive. All the nausea for this one. Flaying a person alive has been employed as a method of execution in different parts of the world for many centuries, including ancient Rome, medieval England, and the Ottoman Empire. The process of flaying someone starts with stripping the clothes of a victim and tying them suspended by the wrist and ankle. They always started with the scalp and the head, as it inflicted the most suffering, and you wanted them to still be alive for that part. Then, making incisions vertically down the body, following the legs, buttocks, and torso, they would peel back and remove the skin as intact as possible. In some instances, parts of the person's body were even boiled to make the skin softer and easier to remove. So that's 2 for 1 torture right there. There were a few ways you could die from flaying, but never from flaying itself. Shock, blood or fluid loss, hypothermia, or infection are some potentials. The time of death could also be anywhere between a few hours and a few days. In the aftermath, many of these corpses would be hung on stakes for their display, their skin either discarded or hung up beside inside them. Boiling point is number 3. Large cauldrons were used by the Japanese for boiling fish to retrieve oil, preparing rice, soups, and cooking people alive. This particular torture was a remnant of the Warring States period that I've mentioned to come before Tokugawa. They were completely masochismic in that time period. The Tokugawa Empire saw that and ended quite a few of these punishments because of it. But not at first. This is why I can tell you how the Tokugawa would fill these jumbo-sized cauldrons with cold water and put it over a blazing fire. As the water began to warm, the accused would be told, hop on in. What starts as an arguably nice toasty bath begins to boil. The accused is to remain in hot water until they confessed. Now, this was only used as an ordeal when the judge and jury were very convinced of a person's guilt, but the person just wasn't fessing up. It could sometimes also constitute as a mode of punishment or execution. For example, an entire family in the 16th century were boiled alive in a gigantic bathtub as a punishment for a failed assassination. Another fun ordeal was using a pan of boiling water and having the accused dip their arm into it. If they refused to do it, they were assumed guilty. If they did and got burned, they were also assumed guilty. Only if you could stick your arm in boiling water and come out unscathed are you innocent, because that makes sense. Now, gentlemen, tune out and don't say I didn't warn you. The next is the sack squish. According to the 1622 Contemporary Chronicles, the teenage Sultan Osman II suffered an excruciating death by compression of, well, his boys, by assassin known as Pevlian the oil wrestler. That's right, an oil wrestler crushed his scrot till he died. Wild. Sack crushing is a punishment that was performed as slowly as possible to worsen the intensity of a victim's agony and lengthen its duration. And it was often performed by a vice that would make them burst from the inside and then crunch the spermatic cord with a plier-like attachment. This victim was usually held upside down while this occurred so that they're unable to pass out or enter a state of shock while the torture occurs. This was also because the condemned usually was vomiting repeatedly, so it was just easier to hang him upside down over a bucket. Despite vomiting, the men rarely screamed. This is because the pain would be so physically overwhelming enough that it would affect his ability to even breathe. They would, however, thrash around wildly as each of the boys burst and then the cord was crunched. And don't worry, they would make a full day of torture out of this. Interesting to notice how usually these public spectacles drew crowds due to the lack of entertainment and also their intention to be a public spectacle. Well, unlike flayings or drownings or dismemberments where there's usually jeers and cheering, apparently with a good old sack squish the crowds remained silent and shocked the whole time. Onlookers, male and female, are recorded to have vomited at the sight. And now, a race for your life. This strange custom began in the 18th century and lasted well into the 19th. This custom only applied to viziers of the Sultan who committed a crime or were simply told they were being executed. It happened a lot, and for next to no reason. The official would be summoned to a meeting with the head gardener, and after exchanging greetings, the vizier would be handed a cup of sherbet. If it was white, then the Sultan had granted him life. If it was red, he was to be executed. As soon as he saw red sherbet, the vizier would start sprinting. Well, that's because the color red was the color of blood, and if the vizier wanted to keep it in his body, he could escape his fate by beating the head gardener, who moonlighted as the Ottoman's executioner by the way, in a race through the palace gardens. The head gardener was honor-bound to a foot race through the gardens to the place of execution near the fish market gate on the southern side of the palace, a distance of around 300 meters. If the vizier was able to finish the dash before the head gardener / executioner, their sentence would be reduced from death to simple banishment. If the gardener was there, you might as well just keep running right off of a cliff. It isn't clear how this racing tradition got started, although one can speculate it was probably inspired by condemned individuals literally making the mad dash. The last man to save his neck by winning a life or death sprint was Grand Vizier Hakia Sahil Pasha in November of 1822. Hakia, whose predecessor had only lasted 9 days in office before being executed, not only survived the death sentence, but was so widely esteemed for winning the race that he went on to be appointed the Governor General of the province of Damascus. The first lady on our list is Julia Agrippina. You may remember her from one of my first videos on the channel, Top 10 Mad Queens in History That Spoiled the Throne. She's remembered as the sister of the savage Emperor Caligula and the mother of the later Emperor Nero, but also as the Empress of Poison. She extinguished the flame of many men, including both her first husbands. The first was simply out of irritation, but the second husband she poisoned so that she could marry her uncle, Emperor Claudius. After marrying her uncle, Agrippina convinces him to adopt her son Nero from her first poisoned husband, and thus make him the official successor. Claudius did it, and once he had it was like sand through the hourglass, his time was soon to be up. Agrippina poisons Claudius in response to his inability to keep it in his tunic. Not interested in jealous adversaries competing for her attention, Agrippina pulled her classic move and just killed her husband. Nero came to the throne as a teenager, but for the years leading up, Agrippina was the empress and ruled in Nero's name. Once he was of age, Agrippina had a difficult time letting go of the reins, and takes it a little too far by constantly second-guessing her son's decisions or making him look unexperienced. AKA, she bugged his ego in that mom kind of way. Nero banished her, and after several attempts to end her life, he finally succeeded in 59 AD. A story of lust is that of Empress Phaeon. Her origins may be humble, but Empress Phaeon is known in history for being so wanton that she had been the main protagonist in many lewd Chinese pieces of literature. Apparently, the reason the ancient chronicler Li Xiang began to compose his classic biographies of exemplary women's book is to remind emperors to choose a virtuous empress. Shockingly beautiful, she was called the Flying Swallow, meaning Phaeon, because of her ability to dance elegantly like a bird. In 18 BCE, she captures the attention of Emperor Chang, the ruling Han dynasty, while acting as a server. Chang became enticed by her. He turned Phaeon into one of his concubines with her sister Hera. Phaeon, wanting to climb the ranks, accuses the favored consort of witchcraft and has her exiled. Once she's out of the way, Phaeon said the same lie about the Empress Zhu. Chen wasn't very happy in his relationship with the Empress, so while he knew the charges against the Empress were false, he used it as an excuse to just have her demoted. With the Empress position vacant, he decided to make Phaeon his Empress. During this time, Empress Phaeon and her second lady, sister Hera, killed any offspring of the Emperor to keep their position secure. This is because Phaeon went to extreme measures to try and get pregnant but was unable. As a result, the Emperor never had an heir. He passed away in 7 BCE, and Phaeon's sister Hera is forced to take her own life out of the suspicions she'd somehow caused his death, which by the way was a stroke. She remains Empress alongside the new Emperor Ai, and when he passes, a child ascends to the throne, and the Wang family uses the opportunity to strip Phaeon of her title and send her to the North Palace for deposed empresses. It's here, sisterless and her husband and title gone, she takes her own life. Our next brutal babe is Empress Dowager Cixi. She's one of China's most famous empresses for her ruthless personality and resilience. Born into a distinguished family of Manchu lineages, she arrived as a concubine to the Emperor Xiafeng in the Forbidden City in 1851. She quickly became pregnant with a son, and paired with her analytical mind, she becomes the Emperor's favorite. He discussed political matters with her, and she became well informed of the status and liabilities of the state, gradually growing more powerful. So when the Emperor died, Cixi did everything she could to gain political power. First, by ordering the Emperor's regents take their own lives, and that her son, Tongzi, be crowned emperor. Seeing as he was a child, she governed the state during his reign, and then during that of her nephew's reign. When he was put on the throne, she ordered him to be put into the reclusion of the palace within the Forbidden City, isolating him from the world. Her own interests, schemes, and revenge always came before matters of the nation, yet this was effective. She ruled the Chinese government for an impressive 47 years. Even if she's also remembered for squandering money on luxurious banquets where she would request 150 dishes each time. She was always seen drinking from jade cups and using solid gold chopsticks. At the end of her life, she still held grudges for her locked-away nephew, Guangzhou. She killed him through arsenic poisoning, and then she herself died one day later.
Number 7. The Iron Chair. Not to be confused with the Iron Throne, although I'm sure that one wasn't too comfortable to sit on. Just a chair of swords. The Iron Chair has spikes covering the back, all along the armrests, the seat. There's spikes everywhere. It's dangerous. 500 to 1500 rusty spikes on average per chair. That's a lot of work. It's a lot of welding work. Oh my gosh. The victim's wrists were tied to the chair, of course, because you'll want to get off of it immediately. Now that's bad enough, being stuck sitting on this chair, but some variants got creative and made it even somehow worse. Some variants of the Iron Chair had holes underneath the chair's bottom, and that's where red hot coals would be placed to cause you severe burns. It's like from Casino Royale, only a lot worse. Sometimes weights would even be added, making matters much worse. Now this chair was meant to get a confession out of the accused, because although it sounds quite fatal, no spikes could actually penetrate a vital organ, and wounds were closed immediately by the spikes themselves. Sounds awful, but it wasn't the worst. I mean, it is, but you know what I mean. You didn't die all the time.
Up next, let's meet Empress Irene of Athens. She was born around the year 750, and there is little information about this early life. However, she was adopted into a family that had huge influence over politics. It's because of this that it seems Irene was destined to be involved in conspiracy, manipulation, and violence. Because her family's influence, she's married to the son of the Byzantine ruler Emperor Constantine. Leo picked her up from the bride show, and they had a son together. When the emperor passed, the son Leo became the new emperor, making Irene the empress. Since their son was only 9, many conspirators sprung for a chance to dethrone him. Irene called for some backup, which included a number of Byzantine-era special forces known as the excubators, whose purpose was to protect them and banish or whip any who had no loyalty. But her son started to get power-hungry with age. He wanted to have the throne and threw a literal tantrum to get it, ending with an open rebellion. While Irene was forgiving of her son at first, he kept trying again and again. He couldn't get the hint. After he ran away to the provinces and her army had to go retrieve him, no amount of begging at his mother's knees spared him any longer. Furious, Irene told her men to rip out his eyes. They actually did so, in front of her, and he died. In her later years, after an uprising and now heirless, she moved away from the empire and became a wool spinner instead. Call that humble retirement.
Number 5. Sawing. Yeah, sawing. Again, another one I don't have to explain too much here, hopefully. Mostly seen in Rome, Spain, and some portions of Asia. It's common. It's a pretty common, straightforward idea, sawing is. You can imagine this one already, right? We sure hope you can because, well, we can't show it. Of course. This is another straightforward one, unfortunately. Capital punishment at its cruelest, getting sawed in half. Again, to the public. Yeah, here's a fun one. Here's a fun show. Drive-in movies or sawing? I'm not sure. Here's a fact that some folk don't quite realize. This one sends shivers down my spine. But sometimes the sawing was done from top to bottom, not side to side. It's almost impressive, right? It's like cutting a carrot in half vertically. It's a little awkward. It's rolling around a bit. But you know what? They did it. Somehow. Through bones and your soul.
Now for the mama-in-law herself, Empress Wu. Of all these female rulers, none have aroused so much controversy or wielded such great power as the monarch whose real achievement and character remains obscured behind many layers of mystery. Wu Zetian was the first woman in 3,000 years of Chinese history to rule in her own right, and technically the only. Since she entered the palace as an educated, rich young concubine, Wu managed to obtain power. First as a favored consort to the ineffective Gaozong, emperor, then the power behind her young son's throne, and as a monarch herself. She was ruthless and decisive, and it's the reason she was able to stabilize and consolidate the Tang dynasty from straight collapsing. Since then, the Tang period is recognized as the golden age of Chinese civilization. She starts as a concubine serving Emperor Tiazong, and then becomes a concubine to his son, Li, when he took the throne. Okay. So she creates a creepy lie to get the empress kicked out and locks in her role as empress by having a son. Then she poisons, supposedly, Emperor Li. Then her son dies of mysterious circumstances, you know what's up, and Wu finally took rule. Declared empress in 690 at the age 65, she's known for killing or locking up anyone that stood in her way. She had her own army of secret police to spy on her enemies and eliminate them. She started some of the most horrific torture trends of ancient China as well. She eventually abdicated the throne to let her son rule. Not long after, she passed away at the age of 80. Now you can watch her story in the popular 2013 Chinese costume drama, Women of the Tang Dynasty, based on the era of Wu Zetian.
Number 3, rats. Another Game of Thrones classic. If you're a rat person, I know there's a lot of people who do tricks with their pet rat. That's cool, but maybe cover Stuart Little's eyes for this one. Rats as a medieval punishment, where do I even start? Okay, this one was a punishment for the rats at the same time. What was once called a rat trap involved a man or woman being tied down to something, and then a metal enclosure would be strapped down to their chest or their stomach. Now inside this metal enclosure, there's rats, which are also just loose walking around, and the person can feel them, the little feet walking around in their skin. And this is when the person instilling the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Historically, it was hot coals that were usually placed on top, or there's a fire underneath, which quickly creates a hot environment for the rats inside. From there, the rats begin frantically searching for a way out, but because it's made of metal and they can't bite through that, they find your skin, and then that they can obviously bite through. So you can paint the picture in your head.
You can be brutal to others, but what of oneself? Meet Empress Elizabeth. She is one of the most beautiful women who have ever lived, and it's exactly the way she wants to be remembered. And while bathing yourself in olive oil or washing your hair with eggs and cognac may seem like some hack beauty strategies, they kept this 1880s Austrian empress and Hungarian queen at her best. Born into the royal Bavarian house of Wittelsbach and the nicknamed Sissy, Elizabeth enjoyed an informal upbringing where her hands-on mother and father raised her to explore the countryside and enjoy creative musings. It's why when she's wed to Emperor Franz Joseph and thrust into formal Habsburg court life, she begins to descend into depression. The prospect of marriage had already had Elizabeth crying in the carriage on the way to the palace, mourning her freedom. She takes up acts of defiance such as smoking, horse riding, and gymnastics. The slander she received for her hobbies, paired with those angrily lusting or bitterly jealous of her beauty, only contributed to her unhappiness. It's easy to see Sissy was in deep emotional pain, thus why she threw herself fully into the upkeeping of her beauty. She felt it's all she had to offer, all she had to maintain, and the only thing left to lose. She suffered from an eating disorder and severe depression as a result, and Elizabeth kept her weight at approximately 110 pounds and a 16-inch waist for the entirety of her life. Her overbearing mother-in-law and dull husband never cared. The sudden death of her infant daughter Sophie was followed by further tragedy with the loss of her only son Rudolph in a murder-suicide in 1889. Empress Elizabeth's tragic life ended in an equally tragic death after she was assassinated with a needle file in 1898. You can learn about her life in Netflix's movie The Empress. And last but not least is Empress Fredegunda. She is balls to the walls nuts. Her background is a mystery. We're pretty sure Frede was Frankish. Then when she was in her late teens, she was sold as a slave to the wife of the King Chilperic of the Susoyans. Now, she doesn't stay like that long though. She seduced the king and convinced him to ditch his wife, which he does. But he marries someone else, and then Frede worked her magic again, and the new wife showed up magically strangled in her sleep. The Emperor King marries Frede out of what I assume is self-preservation. Only took her a year and a half to go from a serf to the Empress Queen. Now, that girl that she strangled was the sister of her own sister-in-law, who was a warrior baddie queen named Brunhilde. Naturally, Frede and her new husband have a 7-year war with his brother and Brunhilde, which they win, and Frede made sure to execute the top government officials through systematically them joint by joint with white-hot pokers and knives. With Brunhilde, who ran for the hills, sort of out of the way, Frede continued her mad rampage to consolidate power for her husband, and their now newborn son. She circles back to her husband's exiled first wife and has her killed, then has some conspirators tortured on the rack with some crap talkers, and she let wolves and lions eat their broken body. She then smoked out the clergy because they were stupid enough to voice their opinions on her violent lady behavior. Her favorite way to kill was via bands of thugs and poison-doused blades. When her husband is assassinated, she flees to Paris and lives in the Notre Dame. For the most part, things were successful under her rule, as she ruled solo for a decade, capturing several cities near Paris, allied with the powerful kingdom of Burundi. There's lots of other crazy stories of Frede, but I'll leave those for another time. She eventually sorted everything out with her kids, handed the reins off to her son when he was old enough to be king, and then died peacefully in her bed in Paris in 597 AD.
Now, kicking off our list at number 10, the boot. Anything that starts with a the, it's bad news right there. Oversized boots made of iron or copper, these are a little different than Uggs, pay attention. These boots were often brazed onto the floor, so the accused, well, ideally they couldn't move around anywhere at all. Most of the time they were just sitting upright, they were stuck, it was welded to the ground. The boots at this time were filled with boiling water or molten lead, both pretty bad. And from that point on, well, it's not gonna be great. You're probably not gonna survive. Another medieval punishment involving boots, which is somehow worse, in my opinion, was first seen in Ireland. They were lightweight metal boots that were filled with water and then heated over a fire until the water was boiling, as well as your feet. I don't know, comment down below, which is worse? To me, the second one is way worse. I don't like a slow boil. I don't like that. A watched pot never boils. Maybe that trick will work, who knows? Number 9, the InStep Borer. We'll start at the feet and then we'll make our way up through the body. Why not? The InStep Borer was a medieval German punishment instrument. Again, quite creative, these medieval folks. This iron boot was much more mobile than the last pair of boots, that one for sure. See, this was just one shoe, rather. A shoe that hinged open to allow your foot to slide in. And then from then on out, just trouble. Slow chaos. A crank would protrude out of the top of the foot, and if you were to turn said crank slowly, well, on the inside of this iron shoe was a thick serrated iron blade, cutting deeper and deeper with each rotation of the crank. This location of this crank was purposeful because most of the time, the accused would bleed out fast. No recovering from that one. Still better than Uggs, in my opinion, but whatever. Number 8. Branks. Ah, the branks. Here we go. Sounds horrible. Branks were used to punish nagging wives. wives, or slandering wives, or cursing wives, or women who performed or practiced witchcraft. If you criticize Christianity, love it. But if you had an opinion or you can do math, you get the branks pretty much. It was horrible. A scold's bridle, or branks, much more fun to say, was a device usually reserved for women. Yeah, classic medieval times history. It wasn't just a muzzle either. We always look at it as if it was a muzzle. No, it was a lot worse than that. It was a cage for the head with an iron plate projecting into the mouth, even pressing down on top of the tongue. More often than not, this plate was studded with spikes so that if the tongue moved at all, ergo if you were to speak, it would cause you to bleed out. Now again, you can't open your mouth with this device, so that is double trouble. It was first seen in Scotland back in 1567 and later used in England. Branks were commonly used again on women of the lower classes whose speech was troublesome. Yeah, what does it even mean, right? Some shaped like an animal's head, so you'd have a cow for somebody that was considered lazy, a donkey for someone considered a fool, a hare for an eavesdropper, or a pig for a glutton. Yeah, God forbid you had an opinion in the Dark Ages.
Empress Lucy set the standard for victim blaming, but she is also the first empress to China, so girl boss moment I guess. She's wife to Emperor Liu Bang, who founded the Han Dynasty. Without her, the Han Dynasty would have struggled to establish itself, but it was her intelligence that was a crucial role in centralizing her husband's rule. Part of it was also her cruelty. She was persistent in gaining and keeping power, and had several aristocratic families wiped out so she and the emperor would maintain authority without any concerns. The empress keeps her rage and tactile cruelty aimed outside the palace while the emperor is alive, subjecting it towards prisoners and criminals. But once the emperor died, the empress famously turned on her deceased husband's concubines. His most favored, named Kizi, is memorialized in the story for meeting a brutal end. She had given birth to the emperor's son, Ru Yi, who would be next in line for the throne. The empress was not about that power change and made sure that the boy was dealt with permanently. Kizi was her hands and feet were chopped off, and that should have been the end of it if anything, but the empress also had her eyes removed. Then she deafened the woman using needles and went so far as to force a noxious mixture down her throat that caused Gizi to become permanently neurologically damaged. The former concubine was then abandoned in a pigsty. Yeesh. Up until her dying day, the empress was known to make others suffer so that she could have all the power to herself.
Number 6, coffins. I'm not talking about, these types of coffins with vampires, like, coffins you bury in the ground. That would be a bad way to go out, no doubt about it. But this coffin that I'm talking about, much, much worse. Here, the victim was placed up high, not down below. They were placed up high in a cage that was so small you could barely fit inside of it. Stuck in one spot, usually with limbs sticking out. The live victim was most of the time left to starve or die of thirst or exposure. Yeah, those limbs sticking out, insects, the sun all day. It doesn't matter what you get at this point, but it's slow and it's gonna suck. And of course, in medieval fashion, it's gonna be quite public. Everyone's not working, no one has jobs in medieval times. We're all just watching some guy stuck in a cage. We're like, sure, this is it, we're living. UFC. Number 5, keel hauling. Not to be confused with Kegels, keel hauling was reserved for the worst of the worst at sea. This was used by pirates for sailors who disobeyed orders and all that jazz. The victim would be suspended by a rope with rocks or weights around their ankles, then they're lowered to the keel of the ship where all the sharp barnacles live. After so long, these ships are so old, it's just piled on, layers and layers of barnacles. Then they would get dragged all along them with the water and everything. Water plus pain, it's a lot, it's a deadly combination. Anything to do with barnacles in the sea, no chance. I'll literally tell you anything, Blackbeard. Anything. Number 4, damnatio ad bestias, also known as killing by wild animals. I'm a dog lover too, I can't read this one. Damnatio ad bestias was a form of Roman capital punishment in which the accused was killed by wild animals in the arena. Now, at this point you may be thinking, oh, kind of similar to Gladiator and what they had to do. No, this was much sooner, this was a little different. This was 80 years sooner. Now, at this point, in Gladiator, they could defend themselves to some degree. Those meeting their fate with this method, they were always defenseless, and sometimes tied to one spot, or they were given a small weapon made of wood. It was an insult, really, no chance of surviving. This form of punishment was seen in ancient Rome starting around the 2nd century BC, but 80 or so years later, the Colosseum then saw a similar practice, only then it was public viewing, it was a big spectacle, it was an event, and most importantly, gladiators could fight back with tridents or nets. Both are horrible. I'd rather just get it done with, to be honest. I'm not fighting a lion. No way. Look at me. I'm like 110 pounds soaking wet. I'm not gonna fight. I'll fight a zebra, maybe. I'll fight like an emu. I could probably take an emu. Necklacing. I'm never wearing my necklace ever again. Here we go. Necklacing is a terrifying practice that involves a rubber tire, not a necklace, a rubber tire, and unfortunately it involves a human being as well. The rubber tire is filled with petrol, which is then put around the victim's chest and arms, and they can't move, and then after that they are set ablaze. Yeah, you figured that was coming. You think I'm talking about The Hills Have Eyes or something terrible, but no, this was real life. I mean, I'm sure you can figure out what happens next, but this method, sadly, can take up to 20 minutes for somebody to pass away from. Little different than the elephant stuff, you know what I mean? They're just left suffering the whole entire time. This one wasn't too public. Nobody could stick around for this one. Cause you know, 20 minutes? No way. I could barely get through a 10-minute YouTube video. You wanna watch this guy burn for 20 minutes? Good joke, how horrible. Number 2, rats. If you're a rat lover, this one's gonna suck. I know some people have rats, they like to do tricks and crawl around their neck and in their mouths. That's cool. I'm not a rat guy myself, but don't knock it till I try it. Rat punishment originated in ancient Rome, and ever since then, it unfortunately has been part of the most horrible, gruesome punishments every era past. What was once called a rat trap involved a man being tied down to something and then a metal bin or an enclosure, a bucket of some sort, strapped to his abdomen or his chest. Now inside this enclosure, there are rats, which the strapped down person can definitely feel walking and sniffing around on your bare skin. Now this is when the person instilling the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Historically, hot coals were usually placed on top, which of course very quickly creates a bad hot environment for these rats inside. Now from here, these rats begin to panic, right? They frantically search for a way out, any way out, because like us, they have survival instincts. Metal enclosure is too hard to bite into, but a human's flesh is not. You can probably eat your way through that. You can see where this is going, and you probably just went at your computer. Yeah, there we go. Now you get it. Let's move on. Poor rats as well, right? Like, come on, those little animals, they don't want to do that. They don't want to eat a 6-pack today. I don't want that. Finally, number 1, the rack. The rack was a device that was made out of a wooden rectangle as a frame. You've probably seen this in Game of Thrones, and that's about it. The person being punished here would have their limbs attached to the 4 sides with chains, and then the people doing the punishing, with the helps of rollers and pulleys and a couple of very strong guys, they would stretch out the person until either the limbs were torn clean off from the body or they got pulled out from their sockets and then couldn't be used anymore. As I'm saying this, I want to faint. This is so horrible. I said I felt lightheaded typing this up. This is really bad. Imagine being around in a time where people actually used to do this and you didn't just watch it on Game of Thrones for 12 bucks a month. And again, more often than not, it was public. So embarrassing. Watching your shoulder get popped out, you're like, oh, just stop. Starting our list off at number 10, trial by elephants. Yeah, we'll start with animals. You know what? I love animals. Why not? First of all, I'm not sure if you've ever seen an elephant in real life before, but these things are mightier than you can ever imagine. They're gorgeous animals, but they're incredibly dangerous to be near. Their foot is like, it's massive. It's like a huge tree stump. It's insane. For this punishment, we have to head to a place, of course, where elephants can be found. That's probably a promising start. South and Southeast Asia. Elephants have been trained for years to trample the accused. Now, depending on which elephant you get in this horrible, horrible demise, they were trained to either get the job done fast or slow. Yeah, imagine an elephant getting the job done quickly. Sounds like something you'd never want to witness for yourself, right? Wrong. No, these punishments were all public. It was almost like a show, like ancient Romans Colosseum. We think of that and we think of lions and we're like, wow, that must have been terrifying. Yeah, imagine that, but now it's an elephant with a big floppy nose too. Really loud. They're loud. That's a scary way to go. But at least that's a quick way to go, unlike this next one here. Number 9, drawing and quartering. You know you're screwed when there's an and, drawing and quartering. Wait, there's more. This is one of the most infamous methods of punishments. Now, this punishment was first doled out in England back in the 13th century. Now, the accused was, of course, as you'd guess, drawn or tied to a horse and then, well, dragged to the gallows. And then at that point, they would usually be hanged, maybe disemboweled, maybe beheaded, maybe be withered. I don't know, other words that start with B, that's pretty horrible. Afterwards, the guilty was, of course, as you guessed, quartered. In other words, he had his body split into different parts. You know, sometimes each limb would be tied to a different horse and they'd have them run in different directions. It was creative, if I'm being honest, a little bit creative. The choreography, the timing here, it was impeccable. This punishment was reserved for those guilty of treason and was thankfully abolished back in 1867. So no more horses involved. Poor animals. Number 8, strappato. Strappato sounds like an Italian artist. It's for sure not. It's definitely not an artist. No. It's creative, again, I'll admit, but in the worst ways. It's an uncomfortable form of punishment, unlike others on this list. It doesn't necessarily always end in death. In strappato, the guilty is strung up by their wrists behind their head. Now, at first, this doesn't sound too bad, but Again, just wait. The awkward angle is pretty much guaranteed to cause dislocation of the shoulders, but if that doesn't really kill ya, weights may be added, and then at that point, your body's not going to recover. Thought to have originated in medieval times, of course, always medieval times, could have guessed that one. During the Inquisition, strappado has been used, sadly, into the 21st century. I don't know what they do in UFC, but there's probably a little bit strappado going on there. Little armbar strappado? No thanks. Number 7, the rack. On to something not so hot and fast, but rather dull and slow. The rack is surprisingly well known. It was originally introduced to the Tower of London around 1420. The Duke of Exeter referred to this device as his daughter. What a weirdo. It's like guys who call their car like she. It's like, okay, just a little bit too close to your automobile, man. Relax. It was an open bed frame type device where your ankles were tied at the bottom and your hands were tied at the top. Already we're off to a horrible start. It was horizontal as well, and sometimes it was up. It was all bad. It would just leave you hanging by these ropes, and these ropes were slowly tightened more and more, obviously causing some problems to muscles and joints that were, holding things in place. This was done to extract information. This is also one of the worst things I've heard. Even getting tickled like this would be horrible. I couldn't even imagine. I make jokes because I'm uncomfortable. Honestly, hit that thumbs up to spread some good vibes because we're not even halfway done. Number 6, molten metal. I don't have to explain this one. You've seen Game of Thrones. This is the worst. This should have been number 1 maybe. I don't know. I'm guessing myself right now. This skin crawling punishment was a form of capital punishment because, well, yeah, there's no way you're gonna bounce back from this. While gruesome, this punishment has a fairly simple explanation. They would just pour molten metal or something extremely hot and not great down the accused throat. I'll tell you what, that's probably gonna do the trick. At least it's gonna be fast, right? In Game of Thrones, it was pretty fast. There was like 3 minutes left in the episode. Guy did it. Boom, roll credits. That's fine. That's a good way to go. Beats elephants, in my humble opinion. Usually during this punishment, they would do things to ensure that your throat would stay open during the pouring of the hot metal. And to that I have to ask, does that even matter at this point? Put on my face, my back, my feet, either way, I'm fainting, and I'm not waking up. Sounds like that show Uh-Oh from the 90s. Just dumping things. I don't want anything dumped on me. Milk, molten metal, rats, nothing.
This daughter-in-law made the empress before her proud, Empress Wei. She was married to the Emperor Zongzang, who was the son of the renownedly merciless Empress Wu Zetian, who you'll learn more about later. It seems Wei tried to emulate her mother-in-law's evil ways to gain power and influence as she had. The couple did have a slight bump in the road when Xiongzong was exiled when his brother took the throne, but they reascended after 705. Now that Wu Zetian had died, the spiteful Wei was determined to get a hold onto power. She began to interfere in state affairs. In order to get what she wanted, she manipulated and mobilized spies and supporters of Wu Zetian that she had gathered while in power. This is how Wei gains control of the entire court, her husband a mere puppet. She uses this power to kill all her enemies by framing them with ingenious plots and having them exiled or executed. While the emperor finally sees through his wife, she wastes no time poisoning him using his favorite food. That's cold. Eventually her plans failed in lieu of her inane puppet husband, and her former sister-in-law jumped to power. Wei ended up being beheaded in 710.
Mozzatello. Occasionally used by the Papal States for only some of the most, terrible crimes or crimes that were considered bad at the time. Basically, the person who was being taken care of, they would be led to a scaffold that was located again in the public square. Classic. Everyone come on out. Grab your family, your aunts, your uncles. We're watching something today. Classic. This person would be accompanied by a priest, and on the scaffold would lie a coffin. How fitting. A coffin, and of course a masked executioner who is dressed in all black with a zipper mouth probably. I don't know. A prayer would be said for the soul of the condemned, because, sure, everyone's watching like, oh yes, of course. And then when that time came, the executioner would swing a mallet into the air and then bring it down on the head of the prisoner. Now, sometimes, and hopefully this one blow would be enough to take their lives, and sometimes it would just render them unconscious, which would then lead them to their throat being, you get it. None of these sound great, but this one, it sucks really bad. It's like, hey, you're gonna get hit, and then it might get worse. I don't know. Number 3, hanging. Again, a little straightforward, but I'll try and provide some history for this one. Sure, some hanging history. Okay. Ugh. Hanging is quick. That's when it's supposed to be. Hanging can be one of 2 ways: suspension by the limbs as a form of punishment, or hanging by the neck as a form of capital punishment. We don't often think about the first version. Being strung up by an arm, that's gotta suck. That's pretty uncomfortable. I can't even raise my arm in class for longer than 5 minutes. I gotta switch it up. Know what I mean? These shoulders are weak. Strappado, this would have been a nightmare. Strappado was the form in which your wrists were tied behind your head, eventually causing your shoulders to dislocate. I don't know what's worse out of all 3 of those. They all suck. I would do the get it done with. Honestly, I don't want to live for any of this. Impalement. This was another one that was highly requested by you guys. I've heard you comment on this a couple times, so yeah, I'll talk about it. Sure, you weirdos. Impaling, do impaling. Long neck, impaling. I'm like, you got it. I hear ya, I see ya, let's make it happen. Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler or something like that. He liked doing a little bit something like this. This was a popular form of punishment for a very long time, sadly, and was most commonly used as a response to crimes against the state. Although Mr. Vlad, we just mentioned, basically did it to everybody that he didn't like, so I suppose to each their own. Sure. Alright, Vlad III. Maybe Vlad IV won't do that. Let's hope. Impalement was a method of both torture and, obviously, execution that involved, well, just slowly driving a stake or a pole or a spear or a big carrot, something pointy or whatever, through a person in order to completely or partially perforate their torso. There we go. I sound like a Victorian scientist. You can impale somebody vertically or, again, horizontally if you want to spice it up. Instead of going this way, you go, oh, that's really bad. Ducking stools. Medieval times, here we go. If you can do math, you're going for a swim. This was a punishment used in the 16th and 17th century in England and New England. And it was usually a punishment that was reserved for women. Women who could do bed maths. There you go, you're a witch. Have a nice dip. This punishment was given to a woman for doing what was considered unwomanly things. Back then, whatever that was supposed to mean, and it was ridiculous. Apparently this included things like having an argument with their husband, taking a dip, fighting with the neighbors, you're going for a swim, gossiping and backstabbing, how dare thee, you're going swimming. Whoever made these rules clearly had never met a man or a friend because, newsflash, everyone does all those things. I did all those before I even came in here to film, so hopefully I don't get dunked in the river. But basically this punishment would see a woman being tied up to a stool and then dropped into a lake or stream over and over again while a bunch of dudes with no teeth watched and they're like, yeah, that's what you get for being smart. And talking back with your opinions. On International Women's Day, we're posting this one too, eh? How ironic is that? Kicking off the list at number 10, boiling. Whenever I get in a bath that's too hot, I think of the medieval times. I can't help it. I can't believe this was once a real thing. I get chills thinking about it. Either water or oil would be used for this ancient punishment. To die by being boiled, that was reserved for those who poisoned others. So if you have any vials of poison, toss it. Don't do it, man, trust me. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. So poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason. Therefore, it was agreed you should be boiled slowly in front of like a room full of people. I would say that's the worst, but I know what's also to come on this list. Number 9. Water. Taking a step away from the worst physical thing one could possibly go through, let's take a look at how far the mind will go before it too breaks. Sensory deprivation is still around today. In fact, there's many who pay for it. Yeah, they lie in a dark tub full of salt, then they float and listen to Childish Gambino. It's a magical experience. Your senses are powerful, especially combined with water. So this dripping machine, this old water punishment, that was just all bad. You had ice cold water dripping on your forehead and your face over and over for hours and hours. Drops would be at different random times so you can predict it as well. My toes are wiggling while I'm talking about this. This is making me anxious right now. In medieval times, they would tie you down and then using a horn, a big ass funnel, they would pour 9 pints of water down your throat. So water is horrible in many ways. Number 8, fire. Can't talk about medieval punishments without mentioning this witchy classic. Commonly practiced in Babylonia and ancient Israel, then later on in Europe with the classic witch hunts, burning at the stake didn't come from churches, like many believe. They didn't call the shots there at all. That was mainly how small towns settled local beef. Yeah, by burning at the stake, instead of just like a fist fight at the park. Burning at the stake came in full swing way back in 1431 in France. French disbelievers like Joan of Arc, they were burned at the stake. It was crazy that they actually did this as a form of punishment. This is one of the worst medieval punishments, and believe me, there's a little bit of a silver lining here. It was quicker than most. Sometimes. Gunpowder was sometimes used so that the burning and stuff would be much faster and brighter and louder and much more horrible. A lot worse on paper, but a lot faster. So honestly, I think it's better. History is insane. Another red-hot punishment used in medieval times was when the accused had to hold a red-hot iron bar and then walk a few steps with it. A red-hot iron bar, your hands were literally toast at that point. Here's where it gets even worse though. 3 days later, the accused would come back to the court, and then when the bandages were removed, if their hands were healing, they started to heal, they were deemed innocent. They were on the path to goodness and whatever. If their hands were still in horrible condition from, say, I don't know, holding a red-hot iron bar, then they were pronounced guilty. That's how the courts worked back then. Number 7, keel hauling. As somebody who's not a fan of water, this type of punishment I can't even imagine. I wouldn't even get on the boat to begin with. Already scary. It sounds like something from Game of Thrones, and it can vary depending on how bad the ocean or the boat is. Imagine that as a lead up. Yeah, the ocean looks pretty rough today. Maybe you'll make it. This punishment was reserved, of course, for sailors at sea. Couple of naughty mateys. Now, it was first performed by the Dutch Navy back in the late 16th century, and what would happen was, well, the accused, they would be tied with a rope and then dragged underwater from one end of a ship all the way to the other, around the rudder, around all that bad shit down there. And while many died, obviously, being flossed around a pirate ship covered in barnacles, it wasn't always fatal, if you can believe that. Not always, but a good amount of time, definitely. Yeah, you're not coming back from that. I can't even hold my breath for that long. No way, folks. Number 6, molten metal. This was another form of capital punishment, and if you've seen Game of Thrones, it'll ring a familiar bell. A few of these do, actually. Yikes. Metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a long time, to the point where it was liquid. It was molten metal, just a soup of minerals. Look, we said this video wasn't for the faint-hearted, and here at Bumblebee, we like to keep that promise. They would then pour the molten metal on your head, or more commonly known, they pour it down the throat of the accused. Obviously, it wasn't done as a method to extract information, it was done to brutally end someone's life. Because they're not talking after that, of course. Execution by molten metal was supposedly done to a wealthy Roman general, Marcus Licinius Crassus, back in ancient times. The metal would burn your muscles and skin, literally cooking it, and then after a few moments, it would harden. Bad, not good. Number 5, denailing. Okay. The forcible extraction of one's fingernails or toenails. Or both. Lovely. Hey, before we move on, let's give that thumbs up a click. Yeah, the little thumbnail right there that we see on the screen. Let's spread a little positivity into this list. I need it. I don't know, I feel like you need it as well. Thank you so much. Back to denailing. This was a favorite method of medieval punishment because, well, sounds horrible, but it was easy. You just needed a really strong guy and some medieval pliers and, well, Bob's your uncle. You're getting a confession. A variant used in medieval Spain introduced a sharp wedge of wood underneath the flesh and in between the actual nail itself, which is horrible. The wedge was then slowly hammered into this grove more and more until the nail popped off. Yeah, thumbs up for thumbnails popping off in history. We try here on B. Number 4, solitary confinement. This is a kind of punishment that still exists in our modern society, but it can truly be one of the worst punishments out there because of the type of psychological distress that it causes. We were all just in a pandemic for so long. We got so bored and we had Netflix and iPads and whatevers. I can't even imagine this back in the day. Basically, it's a prisoner living in a single cell with little to no contact with anybody else. Not even like a guard or anything rattling keys like in the old times. It was just nothing. No one would even check on them. There are many stories about people being locked up for so long they forget about their families, and some people have gone away to solitary confinement for so long that once they're out, they just forget how to speak, really. They forget how to be a human and interact in the real world. Solitary confinement and the negative effects that it has on a person is becoming a wider topic of conversation because of the effects on a person's mental well-being, and it's a topic for a lot of human rights organizations. Back in medieval times, solitary confinement was literally just a room made of stones. It was pitch black, freezing cold, you were tucked away below some janky castle, and most of the time you weren't really alone. In the dark, nibbling away at your little piggies were
this Byzantine baddie reminds us anything is possible. It's Empress Theodora, the Golden Queen. Depending on who you ask, Theodora was an X-rated Cinderella, a Machiavellian villain, or a feminist icon. But she was known to all of us as the wife of Emperor Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire. Born somewhere around 500 AD, nobody is certain of her origins, but it is known her ethnicity was one of a deep tan complexion with dark eyes, and she was stunningly beautiful. She starts as an actress, however back in the day being an actress was often code word for adult entertainment. Our girl Theo was also taking part in some Mission Impossible style BS too, working as a spy for the provinces that surrounded Constantinople. Her next role was that of Empress. When she meets Justinian, Theodora has an art of seduction worthy effect and entranced the man. Even though the law said he couldn't marry her, he changed them so he was able to. Now Empress, she rains brutal terror down on abusers and predators. She punished men who were harmful or ignored a woman's consent. If you were caught attacking a woman or even stood by and failed to stop an attack on a woman, then you could be executed. That and the victim would receive all the attacker's property afterwards. During the Nikiev Revolt, a peasant uprising that was destroying the empire caused by Justinian's tax hikes and unrealistic expenditures, Theo refused to retreat nor let her husband do so. Instead, she made a rousing speech urging her husband and his men to, well, nut up. In Theodora's words, it it looks like it was up to a woman to give an example of courage to men. "Never will I see the day when I am not saluted as empress," she says while Justinian begs to escape by sea. She then declared, "Purple makes a fine burial sheet." Justinian pulls up his pants since his wife isn't letting him go anywhere. She orders her men to herd 30,000 rebels back into the stadium where the riot began and mercilessly cut them down as a lesson to all in the community. Along with her husband, she built up Constantinople with stunning churches and buildings, including the famous Hagia Sophia. She was also the reason that women received new rights, like the ability to own property and divorce no-good husbands.
It's disgusting. Number 2, the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel is literally just a large disc, a pirate ship wheel almost, just lying there, where somebody is then tied to it and everybody else just hammers them and beats the shit out of them over and over. But of course, since we're talking about medieval times, everything has to be a show and whatnot, so once the accused was beaten and then presumed dead, the wheel would lift up and turn just to show everybody what's up. Another way to use the breaking wheel, yep, there was more than one, again, creative folks back then, they would tie a person to the wheel and then continue to rotate it, and then all the ropes below would get tighter and tighter and twist. Kind of like the rack, but with a literal twist. And finally coming in at number 1, the brazen bull. This one takes the rat's problem and then makes it a you problem. Out of all the ones on this list, the brazen bull is the last one that I would do. Straight up haunting. It's also been referred to as a Sicilian bull, and basically it's not too complex. There is a bronze sculpture, often in the shape of, you guessed it, a bull. But in medieval times, it was just a big closed cauldron, and usually it was large enough to fit a person inside. Yeah, this was in a Saw movie too, I believe. That's how you know it's a good one, when it's in the movie Saw. So once the person was locked inside or it was leaned over so they couldn't get out, a fire would then be set underneath this bull, and then you can probably figure out the rest in your head. They would even engineer the bull so that when somebody screamed, it sounded like a bull's roar. How fun is that? How fun is history? I'm learning so much about history that's fun on Bumblebee.